Hello, my name is Obbie Todd. I'm the pastor at Third Baptist Church of Marion, Illinois, and I am an adjunct professor of theology at Luther Rice College and Seminary in Lithonia, Georgia. I do believe in the work of the theologian in the academy, and this book is kind of the fruit of a lot of my studies during my doctorate, which I received at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. I am the father of Roman and Ruby. They're my 4-year-old twins, and my wife, Kelly. And as I said, we live in Marion, Illinois. I've been at my pastorate now for roughly 9 or 10 months. Jonathan Edwards has been dubbed America's theologian for a number of reasons. One, because he was such a titanic thinker. He was a theologian, he was a philosopher, he was a pastor, he was a public theologian. And so, as a Puritan, he thought deeply about the things of God and believed in discipling other pastors. And so, he took a number of young men under his wing, two of which came to live in his home. Their names were Samuel Hopkins and Joseph Bellamy. He personally discipled them, kind of poured into them. They had pastors' hearts as well. They were graduates of Yale University. They believed in revival. They were in the midst of the First Great Awakening. And so what happened was Edwards, even though he was really someone that could never be replicated in terms of theological brilliance, he did manage to pour his ideas and his project, if you will, into a group of men that we now know as the New Divinity. I guess the historians know them as the Edwardsians, but people living between 1750 and 1830 would have known them as the New Divinity, because the New Divinity was a term that was really a term of opprobrium. It was not a good nickname. The New Divinity were theologians who really identified with the Reformed tradition, but they really identified even more strongly with Edwards's ideas. And so they are and have been termed the first indigenous American school of Calvinism in American history. And so that's if I were to kind of give a brief introduction to the New Divinity, I would say they were the true theological successors of Jonathan Edwards. I give a definition in my book at the end of the introduction. I define it in a paragraph. It took an entire paragraph to do. I would, if I could, I would like to quote that: as a public exhibition of the evil consequences of sin and God's displeasure with it, Christ suffered the equivalent of damnation in order to maintain the honor of the law, to vindicate the moral governor, and to achieve the most good for his moral universe. Christ did not endure the actual penalty of the law, but suffered extra-legally, non-savingly, and non-transferably as a substitute for punishments in order to satisfy public justice or rectoral justice, and to open the door for sinners to be pardoned of their sins upon faith by a good and just ruler. If you kind of had to boil down what's happening at the moral governmental theory of atonement, you can think of it, you could really start with the idea of honor. The honor of the law is really the focal point of Christ's death. Christ is taking back, recovering the honor of the law that has been dishonored by our sin. And so what he's doing is, and I've dubbed the moral governmental atonement as cosmic public relations. Basically, Jesus Christ is declaring to the world that the law is good, that it's to be obeyed, that it's glorious, and that it is to be honored. But what's happening is he's not dying under the law itself. Christ suffers the equivalent of what sinners would endure in hell. So I spend a lot of time in my book kind of just distancing my readers from the idea that somehow Christ matches the amount of agony that a sinner would endure in hell, or that he endures so many ounces of pain, like there has to be so many so much blood that's spilt, or things like that. The new divinity were not interested in commercializing the atonement. In fact, they believed that was really the problem with limited atonement, is it turned God into a creditor. This much pain or this much agony and torture for this many sinners. What the moral governmental theory of the atonement is predicated on is upholding the honor of the moral governor who has been dishonored by our sin in God's moral universe. So it's upholding the honor of the law. It's promoting the most good in the universe, and Christ is dying in such a way that he is not dying for each sinner individually, but he's dying for every sinner publicly, and we can kind of get into that later. I point out in the book that during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, British evangelicals referred to the moral governmental theory of atonement as "quote unquote" American theology. So it had its beginnings in New England. It was associated with Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards did not hold to this view, but scholars such as Oliver Crisp have kind of confirmed that. I think, to use Crisp's words, Edwards sowed the seeds to this view. The American setting, the landscape that this view took flight in, it really shaped the view and shaped the theologians in a number of ways, including republicanism. For those who are familiar with America during the 18th century, republicanism was this idea that virtuous leaders, the best leaders, were those leaders who were disinterested. That the object of a republic was to produce a commonwealth where you produced the good of the citizens, and that the best leaders were those who were willing to give up their self-interest for the good of others and to promote the general welfare. Jesus Christ, in the moral governmental theory of atonement, is essentially turned into the classic Republican leader. You could, in some ways, I don't even know if I say this in the book, but in some ways you could say they kind of turned Jesus into George Washington. He's a very public leader. He's giving up his rights, his self-interest for the good of the whole universe. The new divinity kind of conceived of God's moral universe as a cosmic commonwealth, if you will. And so Jesus Christ dies honorably. He dies reasonably. He dies selflessly. They take all of those Republican ideals, which they find in the old Greek and Roman republics, and they really ascribe those attributes to God, or to Jesus Christ on the cross. So the idea of self-interest is something you will not find in the new divinity God. And so that's one thing that's going on in the American milieu at the time. Something else that's going on probably during that time is the what has been called the market revolution. The idea, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, which is published in 1776, the same year of the American Revolution, or of the Declaration of Independence. Adam Smith, for instance, kind of really represents a lot of the thinking during that time, because Adam Smith, even the Constitution or the Federalist Papers themselves kind of bear witness to this idea that people are starting to think that self-interest is a good thing. And so the New Divinity are not interested at all in this greedy notion that if people just seek what's best for them, that everyone will kind of be happy and it'll be the best for everybody. What the New Divinity are interested in is taking away the commercialization of Christ's death. And instead of framing Christ's death as a kind of limited transaction with an elect people, they're interested in framing the atonement more as a public transaction with all of the people in the universe. And so in modern parlance, we would say that the New Divinity, that they were 4-point Calvinists. They believed in a universal atonement. They did not believe in a universal salvation. Universalism was prevalent during that time, especially in New England. And so that was another reason that the New Divinity chose to decommercialize the atonement, because people such as John Murray, the Universalist, he believed that essentially Christ's death was a kind of a transaction for the entire world. And so that gave the New Divinity kind of even more of an incentive to de-quantify the sufferings of Jesus. But basically, the New Divinity were interested in talking less about God as a creditor and more of God as a moral governor. And so that was kind of their project. So there's a lot of different philosophical, moral, economic, theological things going on in the early Republic, and they have a really big bearing, a really big influence on the way that the New Divinity conceived of the atonement. And that's not even to talk about one of the greatest ironies, I believe, in American religious history, is the fact that Jonathan Edwards was himself someone who at least gave his approval to the slave trade, at least the domestic slave trade, whereas Jonathan Edwards's disciples became some of the most outspoken abolitionists in the early Republic. And so you can see that their ideas about what it takes to be a good leader and their ideas about the evils of the slave trade and greed and American consumerism, all of those things are stripped away at the cross. And so the New Divinity are basically framing Jesus in the way that they think the leaders of the nation should be. So that's something that a way that you can think about it. The last thing is I talk about the univocal nature of government. Basically, one of the boldest projects I believe the New Divinity are taking part in is they're attempting to conceive of God's government in the image of their own. And I think that's a really bold thing for them to do, because for centuries it was really thought of as God is transcendent, and we can only, our conceptions of Him should not be molded out of the image of our own. But what the New Divinity are saying is, we can take these principles from our own human governments and we can apply them to God. And so basically in the book, I talk a lot about how, the New Divinity were eager to take human analogies. George Washington's brought up a handful of times. They talk about, the Prince of Wales. They talk about the Prince of France. They believe that all of the materials and illustrations they needed to describe Christ's atonement were right there before them, at least in the late 18th century.